So welcome everyone. I believe this evening is uh pretty much just YCL members, and potentially some party comrades, and of course our comrade Paul Cockshott, who's going to do a good section of this. So this is the educational on hyper-imperialism and multipolarity. There was a bit of reading sent ahead, and if you had a chance to do that, hopefully that'll make this even more worthwhile. If you didn't get a chance to do it, and I'm conscious it was quite long, that's absolutely fine. There should still be plenty for you to get from this. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is establish what hyper-imperialism is, what multipolarity means, and then we're going to sort of break down history and, up until now, what the global economy and political sphere and
Thank you very much.
what that looked like, and then militarily what that implied or what consequences that had. So hopefully it will give you a good understanding of how these things work on the global scale. And in the future, it means when there are political developments across the world, you'll be able to interpret them through this new lens, which will hopefully allow you to interpret the news, so to speak, with an actual Marxist analysis. So that's what we're hoping to get out of this. And I'll hand over to Evan to begin his session.
Okay, yeah, cool. So hi comrades, thanks everyone for coming. I'll be giving a short 20-minute introduction to the hyper-imperialism study itself, which was produced by the Tricontinental Institute. Obviously, I can't do it full justice in just that short time, so I encourage everyone who hasn't read it to please take the time to read it through carefully afterwards and to take notes. It isn't a long document in the grand scheme of things. It'll take you maybe a few days, and it is very important for our communist strategy. So the study itself is based on statistics from over 40 different databases. The Tricontinental Institute's research partner, Global South Insights, used advanced data gathering technology to collect and compile useful information from these sources, many of which are capitalist and imperialist institutions who never intended for their data to be used in this way. And the study is a fantastic example of what can be achieved when cutting-edge technology and advanced statistical analysis are combined with a Marxist-Leninist political analysis in order to develop communist strategy. And we need more studies like this in future. This is exactly what communist research and planning should look like in the 21st century. The study argues that although we are still in imperialism, which is the highest stage of capitalism, imperialism has taken on a new form, particularly as a result of the rise of the United States to become the foremost imperialist power on the planet, as a result of the age of neoliberalism, which has fundamentally transformed the imperialist economies from productive manufacturing economies to unproductive financial economies, as a result of the counter-revolution in the Soviet Union, which emboldened imperialism for a time, and as a result of the subsequent rise of the People's Republic of China, other socialist nations, and the national liberation struggles throughout the global south in the age of neocolonialism. The study argues that hegemony is lost in three stages, including production, finance, and military. The US has already lost its hegemony in production, with production largely moving to China and the global south, and its financial hegemony is being challenged through the process of de-dollarization and the emergence of more equitable international financial institutions outside of US control. But the US still has unparalleled military hegemony throughout the world, and it has moved to a strategy of relying on this superiority in order to make up for the hegemony it has lost as a result of these other factors. With its number one target being its main economic competitor, which is socialist China, its number two target being capitalist Russia on the border of Asia and Europe. There's also North Korea and Iran, which are probably next in line due to being nuclear powers. There has recently been a successful regime change in Syria, and Venezuela, Cuba, and Belarus are all other immediate targets for regime change. This is all a rational response by the United States to the loss of its economic hegemony and control over the world's productive forces as a result of its mode of production. And so the US cannot be moralized against or reasoned with, and so must be defeated in the wars it is unilaterally escalating against the interests of the overwhelming majority of humanity. The only way to return to a peaceful world is to defeat the United States, and the only way to end war permanently is through socialist revolutions across the entire globe. The consolidation of the US-led imperialist bloc against the socialist and capitalist countries of the global south has recently accelerated, particularly as a result of escalations against China in East Asia, escalations against Russia on the border with Europe, and escalations in the US-backed Israeli genocide against Palestine in West Asia. These are currently three of the main front lines of US imperialism, which seek to conquer and plunder the one continent which the US has so far failed to plunder completely, which is Eurasia. In the last 3 decades, all Eastern European countries have been fully incorporated into NATO, except for Belarus, which continues to resist US aggression alongside Russia, and all Western European countries are now fully subservient to US interests. As a result of this, we are seeing formerly independent imperialist countries acting against their own economic interests in favor of the interests of the United States. Any country which does not fully comply with the US's plans for global domination is labeled a rogue state. The US-led military bloc is the only cohesive bloc in the world and is the de facto military alliance with a central command. The US has abandoned many anti-nuclear treaties over the last 10 years, opening the way for commencing nuclear conflict with Russia or China. The US controls 74.3% of all military spending worldwide, which is over $2 trillion US dollars. It spends 21 times more on its military per person than China, and of the top 16 military spenders, 11 are in the global north, and only 6 out of 145 are in the global south. It is clear that there is currently no such thing as sub-imperialism or non-Western imperialism in the world today. The US currently has 902 known overseas military bases, not including other smaller or secret military facilities and projects. Mapping these bases allows us to understand the US's primary military interests. On the other hand, China only has 1 or 2 overseas military bases, depending on how you define one, and Russia has a handful still under its control in the former countries of the Soviet Union. You cannot be an imperialist country without the physical force to back that up. And the US's military bases are heavily concentrated in bordering regions around China and Russia, and any country with a US military base cannot claim to be fully sovereign, including ourselves. The US is attempting to save itself from economic collapse by conquering Eurasia and balkanizing Russia and China, and there are maps hanging in Washington which show these two countries broken up into small chunks. In the global north, US military bases are mainly concentrated in the former fascist countries, as well as the UK, which has 25 US military bases. There can be no expectation of socialism in Britain without opposition to these outposts of imperialism as a matter of priority. These are the US military bases in the global south. There are 62 in South Korea, whose military operations are completely controlled by the United States to attack communism in China and North Korea and prevent the socialist revolution from spreading across the country. The UK also has 145 overseas military bases, largely a leftover from the days of the British Empire, but particularly focused on West Asia and Africa. The next part of the study looks at the development of imperialism through different stages, and it gives a bit of a timeline. So the period prior to imperialism was defined by the emergence of the global north as hegemonic through campaigns like the Crusades, colonialism, maritime expansion, and the transatlantic slave trade. But imperialism properly defined did not emerge until after Britain became the dominant force in international finance, developing beyond the classical liberal competitive capitalism described by Marx and Engels to an era of finance monopoly capitalism or imperialism. Monopolies emerge as a result of what Marx described as an increase in the organic composition of capital, meaning a greater investment in means of production over labor power, until only capitalists who collaborated could afford investment. British hegemony and imperialism would not have been possible without plundering its empire and colonies such as India, and it is at this time which Lenin wrote his groundbreaking thesis, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. He wrote this in 1916, the year before the October Revolution over 100 years ago, describing 5 main features of this period. Specifically, he was forming an economic analysis of the conditions which had led up to the war and what the war meant for the international working class and how communists should respond. This was one of the most important texts of the 20th century, but needs to be considered within this context. Imperialism does not look the same today as it did in Lenin's time, in the same way as capitalism does not look the same as it did in the time of Marx and Engels. That does not mean we have moved beyond capitalism and imperialism, and we are still in the highest stage of capitalism, but this highest stage has simply taken on a different form to the one it did 100 years ago. World War I was a period of inter-imperialist conflict, but this is not the only form which imperialism can take. The period following the birth of the Soviet Union in 1917 was defined by the decline of the British Empire, inter-imperialist conflict, the rise of fascism, the spread of socialism, and the Great Depression. During this time, Britain is also central to the formation of Israel and ends the pound's convertibility to gold and the gold-pound standard, marking the end of its financial hegemony. The period of inter-imperialist conflict then gives way to the worldwide battle against fascism, involving a short-lived anti-fascist united front between the capitalist and socialist powers. The working class undeniably leads this battle and takes the greatest sacrifice, but socialism also spreads west all the way to Germany, and the Communist Party of Great Britain reaches its highest ever membership. During the war, the European economies are destroyed, marking the beginning of the era of US hegemony. This period following the war marks the era of US hegemony due to superiority of production after emerging from the war relatively unscathed. It initiates the Marshall Plan, which splits the working class and subjugates the Western European countries to the US economically. NATO is also formed as an anti-communist organization which submits the European countries to the US militarily, along with agreements with Japan and the establishment of the Five Eyes. This was the golden era of US imperialism, but at the same time, imperialism is also challenged by an era of national liberation struggles, the emergence of the Third World Project, an end to the era of direct colonialism, and the rise of new socialist nations, most importantly China. This is followed by a period of economic stagnation. After experiments in Chile and Argentina, the UK and the US begin the era of neoliberalism under Thatcher and Reagan. During this time, the US loses its production hegemony, except for some technological hegemony and especially military-related technology. The US also establishes its dollar monopoly and uses neocolonial weapons such as the IMF and the World Bank to transfer its debts to the global south after becoming a debtor nation for the first time. Most importantly, this is when the productive economy moves from the imperialist countries to the global south, with the West shifting to speculative and parasitic finance and monopoly rent-seeking capital instead. The defeat of the Soviet Union emboldens imperialism throughout the world, leading to a much increased pace of US military invasions. Despite agreement not to expand 1 inch to the east, the US expands NATO 7 times, giving the US de facto military control of 14 additional countries. This includes all the Eastern European countries except for Belarus. The Five Eyes is expanded to the 14 Eyes, including former fascist and other Western European nations. The US abandons anti-nuclear treaties, potentially preparing for a nuclear conflict with Russia or China. Global South GDP per capita surpasses the US for the first time, and Putin gives his famous Munich speech, criticizing the dominance of US monopolies and its use of military force, ending any illusion that Russia can be brought under the control of the United States. This period ends with the 2008 financial crash, which the study describes as the Third Great Depression. China is largely unaffected, which causes panic among the US bourgeoisie. Finally, there's the period we are currently in, which is the period of US decline and the rise of the global South. China has become the largest economy in the world and refuses to take the path of the Soviet Union, with Xi Jinping's presidency recognized by the CIA as being a shift to the left, which threatens capitalism's political supremacy. Obama's presidency initiates the US's pivot to Asia strategy, defining China as its strategic competitor and seeking to contain the country and strangle it economically. This, again, is a rational development of US capitalism, which has lost control of global productive forces and monopoly privileges as a result of China's rise. The US's attempt to use military force to make up for its declining hegemony is thwarted on multiple occasions, including in Iraq and Afghanistan. Xi Jinping visited Britain in 2015 under David Cameron, which was the last attempt at friendly relations before following US saber-rattling. The US also withdraws from the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, which offered sanctions relief to Iran in exchange for limiting Iran's nuclear program. The US began sanctioning businesses which traded with Iran, significantly harming the economic interests of Western Europe. In just the past 3 years, we have seen the US rapidly escalating towards a Third World War, particularly through three frontiers of US imperialism around Eurasia: Ukraine, Palestine, and Taiwan. During this time, Nancy Pelosi violated the One China principle by visiting Taiwan. The US has put forward military aid to Taiwan as an act of aggression against China, which intends to complete its national revolution by unifying capitalist Taiwan with the socialist mainland. Russia's special military operation in Ukraine represented a response to the US crossing a red line 30 years in the making, including NATO expansion and placing missiles and troops on Russia's borders. Anti-fascist and communist partisans in the Donbass currently represent the front line of this struggle and have had military support from the Russian Communist Party since 2014, as well as socialist countries like Cuba and North Korea, representing a united front against US imperialism. After this point, Finland and Sweden joined NATO, but NATO had already been expanding for 30 years anyway. This was just two more additional countries. And finally, Hamas-led resistance actions during Operation Al-Aqsa Flood on October 7th represented a response to the continued escalation of the US's vassal state in West Asia, supported by a majority of the Israeli people. The Israeli genocide and continued expansion into Palestinian land is therefore the economically rational action of a state born out of imperialism and colonialism, and will continue for as long as it does not meet resistance, which is currently led by the Palestinian forces, the most progressive section being the PLO, and particularly the communist PFLP and DFLP. This is a period of many contradictions, and communists need to think dialectically about these different contradictions, which are primary and which are secondary. The study defines these 8 key contradictions in today's world, the principal contradiction being the US-led imperialist bloc acting against the interests of the majority of humanity. The study then goes on to define these two main camps: the US-led imperialist camp, also called the Global North or the West, and the China-led broadly anti-imperialist camp, also called the Global South, or historically the Third World. The Global North is an integrated military, political, and economic bloc composed of 49 countries, which is further subdivided into 4 rings: the US-led Anglo-American core, the European core, Japan and the secondary European powers, and the European former Eastern Bloc. The study argues that this is the only imperialist force in the world today, as well as the only consolidated bloc, with the interest of the minor imperialist powers completely subordinate to the interests of the United States through organizations such as NATO. The US-led core represents the inner core of imperialism and the imperialist victors of World War II emerging out of the British Empire. These are the Five Eyes and Israel, which acts as the US's sixth eye in West Asia. These countries work closely together, including a new imperialist military alliance like AUKUS targeting China. The European core is made up of those countries closest to the US-led inner core, including the US's 14 Eyes established by 2001. Following the end of World War II, the former fascist powers and the rest of Western Europe were integrated into the military apparatus of the United States, particularly through NATO. Japan and the secondary European powers involve 15 countries, but particularly Japan, which is a frontline asset in curtailing and suppressing China, Russia, and North Korea, and has been a strategic US ally since the signing of the US-Japan Security Treaty in 1951, which agreed to US military dominance of the country. The European former Eastern Bloc are a new category within the imperialist camp, which have been targeted militarily, politically, and culturally. 14 of these countries have been incorporated into NATO, another 4 are attending NATO meetings, and several are governed by pro-NATO regimes. Belarus is the only Eastern European country which has stood up to US domination and maintains a close partnership with Russia in the anti-imperialist camp. The interests of the Global South are largely defined by what's called negative unity, in the sense that the only common factor of these countries is that they are not fully aligned and integrated into the US-led imperialist bloc. For this reason, despite steps towards organization and unity, the Global South is not a unified group or bloc like the imperialists, and various disputes exist between individual members. However, most of these countries also have a common history of being either colonies or semi-colonies of the imperialist camp, and capitalists in the Global South are losing confidence in the political, economic, and moral leadership of the US and Europe, leading to alignment with alternative economic models like BRICS and China's Belt and Road Initiative. The study groups them into 6 categories: socialist independent, strongly sovereign-seeking, current or historic progressive, new non-aligned, diverse global south, and heavily US militarized. The socialist independent bloc includes all of the socialist countries and most importantly China, which has made the most significant advancement in human development by lifting 850 million people out of extreme poverty in the last 4 decades. Cuba and Venezuela are currently on the front lines of socialist resistance, despite the cruel embargo and heavy economic sanctions. Half of the island of Korea is still occupied by the US, and Laos and Vietnam continue to undergo rapid economic development following a similar path to China. The struggle against US imperialism is not only an act of defense against for existing socialism throughout the world, but the socialist revolutions of all of these countries emerged out of anti-imperialist national revolutions against US imperialism. The strongly sovereign-seeking countries are the prime targets of US-led regime change, as we have recently seen in Syria, and these countries are all on the front line of the Global South struggle against imperialism. They are actively pursuing political independence and face ruthless hybrid warfare from the United States. The most powerful country in this camp is Russia, and the US has provided more than $90 billion in military assistance to Ukraine in an attempt to overthrow Russia and move on to its primary target, which is China. Other examples are Iran, which is a powerful ally of Palestine and Lebanon against Israel, and there are more countries which are joining this camp by taking bolder steps against US aggression, including most recently Burkina Faso, following the recent military uprising led by Ibrahim Traore. There are then 11 current or historic progressive countries which are either next in line for regime change or playing a clear role in speaking out against the imperialist camp, and this includes Brazil under Lula and South Africa under the Tripartite Alliance. Nepal abolished the monarchy in 2008 and is currently led by a progressive alliance, and Palestine has been engaged in an armed uprising against Israel with the backing of progressive forces throughout the world. Cool. And yeah, I'll skip this little bit on the Global South and I'll just get to the summary and the conclusion. Okay. So to sum up the study, and do read it if you haven't already, the US has come to dominate the world and all other imperialist powers since World War II, representing a new era of hyper or super imperialism, where the interests of smaller imperialist powers are subordinate to US interests. This is currently the principal reactionary force on the planet. Opposition to US hegemony is currently led by China in a united front with Russia and other socialist and anti-imperialist countries in the Global South seeking national sovereignty and development. These countries are formally independent, but their sovereignty is threatened by new neo-colonial forms of domination. The US is currently losing its battle to keep its hegemony, particularly in terms of production and finance, and will increasingly rely on military superiority to regain its lost hegemony in other areas. Appeals for peace will not work. The US is acting rationally as a result of its economic system. The battle against US imperialism will primarily be led by the most militant forces, as is the case with armed uprisings in the Donbass and Palestine. Britain is the junior partner to the US and therefore has a large responsibility for building leverage against the United States to support China and defend and advance world communism. Historically, it has been through leadership against imperialism that communists have built trust and respect among the working class and built working class power. Many socialist revolutions have occurred directly after democratic revolutions led by the working class against imperialism, and national liberation from imperialism is a precondition for socialism. We therefore need to improve our political analysis and spread anti-imperialist education among our own ranks, correcting mistaken positions of inter-imperialist conflict, whether with China, Russia, or rising capitalist nations in the Global South, such as Iran. We need to criticize and expose other socialist groups, particularly the Labour left and Trotskyists, which continue to support US imperialism. There can be no united front with those supporting the drive towards a world war, which will lead to tremendous bloodshed. At the same time, we must reject sectarianism. We have to accept that communism in this country is still historically weak, and so support the development of an anti-imperialist united front against a world war. This may mean working with parties we do not like, including other communist groups and other progressive parties. We need to identify pressure points of US imperialism in Britain and build leverage campaigns against it to bring the working class into a resistance struggle, either through correcting the mistakes of existing structures or starting new ones. Our focus should be on breaking the special relationship with the US, for example, through anti-NATO campaigning or US military bases. This is also the best way to expose imperialist parties like Reform UK, which offer no solution to workers in Britain and seek to tie us to the sinking ship of US capitalism. In the words of Mao Zedong, the First World War was followed by the birth of the Soviet Union with a population of 200 million. The Second World War was followed by the emergence of the socialist camp with a combined population of 900 million. If the imperialists insist on launching a third world war, it is certain that several hundred million more will turn to socialism, and then there will not be much room left on earth for the imperialists. It is also likely that the whole structure of imperialism will utterly collapse. And I'll leave it there, and thanks for letting me go on so long.
Thank you for the presentation, Corey. That was an amazing summary of the document. Next, we have Dr. Paul Cockshott on the world crisis, followed by a Q&A.
Okay, shall I start?
Yeah, please.
Okay, I will be putting up slides as well. Just check that these work. I haven't yet tried moving to full screen, so let me just see whether that works. Tell me if it does. Is that working?
Yeah.
Okay. There'll be a lot of overlap between this and what was just covered by Eben. So I'll try and go fast in those points. We have a major political crisis in the world, which has been going on for 2 or 3 years. This is most evident in the wars in Ukraine and West Asia, the repeated threats of wars over Taiwan, threats of banking crises, which were more evident 2 or 3 years ago than they are now, but are probably still in the background, and chronic inflation in the main capitalist countries. But these are an effect of a long-term situation, which is the decline of Western hegemony. The fact that China has regained its position as the dominant economy in the world, which it lost in the 19th century. Finally, the rise of Indian capitalism as a major economic power, and going along with that, the deindustrialization of the Western world, which has now accelerated since the US blew up Nord Stream. So what phases did Western dominance go through? I'm starting a bit later than the previous thing. I'm saying it really started in the 16th and 17th century with the Spanish Empire. And in the 18th century, you then got a struggle between Britain, Holland, and France based on mercantile capitalism tied to shipping. From 1815 to 1921, I say that was the period of dominance of British industrial capitalism, from the defeat of Napoleon to the signing of the Washington Treaty in 1821. During the period, there's an overlapping period from 1898 to 1948. You had the epoch of intra-imperialist rivalry, wars and revolutions. From 48 to 91, you had the period of socialist challenge the defeat of European imperialism and the victory of the national liberation struggles, most significantly culminating in the victory of the independence movement in Vietnam. Then the collapse of the Soviet Union produces a 30-year period of American hegemony, which has now started to be threatened increasingly. We've passed the inflection point. And in 2025, we're seeing the US starting to shift from a policy of world domination to a policy of continental domination of the North and South American continents. So much so that there's open talk of imperialist aggression against Canada and Greenland, which would have been inconceivable in the previous period. So what was the period of Spanish imperialism based on, the Habsburg dominance? It was based on bullion extracted from American colonies, particularly the silver mines of Bolivia. This was shipped to Spain, and this was then used to pay for manufactured goods coming from Holland, England, and China. This then produces its own contradiction in that Iberian manufactures stagnated since it was easier to import from other nations. And this is something we'll see happen repeatedly. So Spain and Portugal fell behind England and Holland economically, and Dutch and English capitalism begins to take over. Under British hegemony, you had a different flow. You had a flow of taxes and tribute from India, because when the British East India Company took over India, it became the tax levying authority. It took over the tax collection from the Indian states and essentially collected taxes which then became dividends of the East India Company and were remitted to London. And that was only possible because of the inter-imperialist wars from 1745 to 1815 against Holland, France, and Spain. The flow of tax revenue from India enabled capital export from Britain. Capital export from Britain was not due to producing a net surplus domestically, but due to the fact that there was an inflow of tax revenues which could be turned into industrial products, industrial means of production, which were exported as capital to the United States, Australia, Argentina, and to a lesser extent to India itself. The effect of this is that capitalism then grows rapidly in Canada, USA, Argentina, and Australia. South Asia, on the other hand, remained largely backward, an agricultural economy with declining living standards and frequent disastrous famines under British rule. Meanwhile, Germany, France, Japan develop as internally funded capitalist economies, where the accumulation of capital is funded by the extraction of surplus within those countries. But what British capital exports have done is analogous to what happened with Spain, in that they created US industrial power, which then replaces Britain. What we had in 1900 was capitalism in the areas that I've shown as pink. These were the areas which had industrial capitalist economies. Limited areas within Russia, around Leningrad and around Baku, places like that. So, who were the great world powers at the time Lenin is writing, when he's writing about imperialism? In terms of industrial power, they were the USA, the German Empire, the British Empire, French, Japanese, and Russian empires. All of those, apart from the USA, openly call themselves empires. In terms of population, the order is different. The biggest state in the world in terms of population was the British Empire. Next came the Chinese Empire, then the USA, then Russia, then Germany. What were the contradictions at that point? There was an Anglo-Russian contradiction over South Asia. There was a Russo-Japanese contradiction over exploiting China, and this leads to the 1905 war. Britain and Japan form an imperialist alliance, and they defeat Russia in 1905. The Japanese do the fighting, but they're armed and equipped with British ships. In addition, you have the contradiction between the USA and the Spanish and German empires. This leads to the USA launching an imperialist war against Spain, seizing the remaining Spanish colonies, Cuba, Philippines, Venezuela. Well, they didn't actually seize Venezuela. There was a conflict over Venezuela, conflict between Germany and the USA over who would seize Venezuela, with the Germans planning to seize Venezuela and declare war on the USA in 1848 in order to occupy that territory. At the same time, there was acute rivalry between Britain and France over African colonies, which almost broke out into fighting between British and French colonial troops in Fashoda. You then have half a century of wars to divide the world, and in the end, the US wins. The important point here is that in terms of industrial capitalism, the same regions existed in 1949 as in 1900. There'd been no spread of industrial capitalism over that period. But the Japanese, Turkish, German, Spanish, Austrian, and Russian empires had been defeated. The British and French empires were bankrupted and heavily in debt to the USA. By 1962, British and French imperialism had essentially been defeated, and the US had become the hegemonic power. I mean, perhaps the more crucial turning period, well, you might say, was 1956, the Suez Crisis, but I've said 1962 being Algerian independence. Why did the US win? Because it had the biggest population, had huge sources of energy and food, particularly oil. It had a high capital to labor ratio compared to other countries, so it had greater labor productivity. And the high wage rates in the US meant that automation and mechanization were more profitable than they were in Britain or Germany. It was a matter of astonishment to Western socialist observers how high American wages were under the Fordist system. And therefore they could outproduce and out-export the rest of the capitalist world. You then have half a century during which revolutions are occurring. From 1898 to 1949, you get revolutions in Russia, China, North Korea, and Eastern European states. And this removes a large group of states from the capitalist domain and poses a potential rival. And this is the bipolar world where the US organized the entire capitalist world under its financial and military control with the aim of wearing down the USA and defeating the national liberation movements. In the process, we get a change in the economic structure of the USA. We see this dialectical process whereby a country initially dominates, but the mechanism by which it dominates gets undermined. The dollar was the world reserve currency in 1945 because the US was the workshop of the world. Dollars were in demand to purchase US goods. And the only way to get dollars was to get loans from US banks. And this enabled US multinationals to take over significant parts of European industry. The important point here is that this is different from Britain. This is a real capital export due to overproduction in the USA and a surplus of manufactured goods coming out of the USA. And this net outflow of capital equipment taking over of factories by US firms results in their modernization and accelerated economic development. Now, by the late 60s, the cost of the Vietnam War, along with the fact that modernized French and German industry was now exporting heavily to the US, meant the US had a trade deficit. And unlike Britain a century earlier, it couldn't just tax India to cover the deficit, or unlike Spain, it couldn't rely on silver imports from Bolivia. So instead, they go off the gold standard because by 1971, the US had issued more dollars than its gold reserves and couldn't back the dollar with gold. That hadn't been an issue previously because they could back the dollar with manufactured goods. France demanded that it got the dollars it held in gold. De Gaulle said, okay, the Bank of France holds large quantities of dollars. We want hard gold in return. And Nixon said, no, we're going to take the dollar off the gold standard. The French had exported cars and consumer goods to the US. That's a real transfer of resources to the US. But the US was refusing to do an equivalent transfer back. So effectively, the US was exploiting France at that point. It was getting Citroëns and cars from France, but there was no equivalent. What was going back was just paper. Because they were able to do this because the dollar had been established as the universal equivalent. Now, it only worked because the Bank of France was willing to take the dollars and issue francs to Citroën people. Now, this gave the US an unprecedented power. The British had been able to tax Asia and Africa. The US instead effectively taxed the rest of the world by seigniorage, the issue of currency. And with this, it could finance an almost unlimited military expenditure. And under Reagan, it used this power of issuing currency to ramp up its military expenditure to a level where the Soviet Union couldn't keep up, and it bankrupted the Soviet economy. And thereby, they established what they hoped would be the American century. Okay. This also meant that US banks, through the credit multiplier, acquired even greater purchasing power than the US government itself. And this meant that lots of firms exported to the US and had built up credit banks at the Wall Street banks. And with this, the Wall Street banks lent to deficit countries in the South and earned interest on that. And when they couldn't meet the interest, the US imposed structural adjustment programs, which essentially meant that they had to privatize large parts of their economy and sell them to US capital. Essentially, by dollar hegemony, the US was able to plunder the world's capital assets, and the US Treasury could effectively tax the rest of the world. So what happens now, though, is that a repetition of the Habsburg fate. The Habsburgs had controlled the universal equivalent of the day, which was the silver thaler, which is from what we get the name dollar. The US was importing manufactures, importing oil, and paying for them in dollars. And this meant that the economies of the East and Southern Asia grew, and the financial position of the Middle East was boosted because of net transfers of dollars to the Middle East. Now, you may say, why does the world put up with this? Well, it's because of what Adam Smith called the mercantile delusion, the idea that money is wealth. A capitalist economy is forced to go through the circuit money, commodity, money prime, more money. That's the whole aim of the economy. And if dollars counters world money, it appears to be rational to do everything you can to get dollars. But this is essentially an illusion. It hides the fact the US is taxing the world. Now, in many ways, the situation of the US is analogous to the situation of Germany in the eve of the First World War. After 1870, the Hohenzollern monarchy had defeated its main rival, France, and established itself as the unquestioned military hegemon within Europe. They had first taken the easy target of Denmark, then they'd gone for Austria, then they'd gone for France, and now they were in the dominant position. But French capital was flowing into Russia, financing Russian industrialization, and the General Staff told the Kaiser that by 1916 they would no longer be the dominant power because of the rapid development of the Russian armed forces, the rapid development of Russian railways, which enabled the movement of troops within Russia. They therefore decided, okay, Lord, it's necessary to fight now rather than later. That's very analogous to the situation, certainly, that the Biden administration was thinking, we've got to fight the Russians and Chinese soon, or we will lose. So the US is in a slightly worse position in that China has already overtaken them. The Kaiser expected Germany to be overtaken by Russia within a few years. And the aim of the Kaiser was to quickly knock out his weaker rival, France, before turning on Russia. The Schlieffen Plan was intended for that. This is essentially the same strategy as the Americans have been following the last few years. Try and knock out the weaker rival, in this case Russia, before turning on China. Unfortunately for them, like the Schlieffen Plan failed at the Battle of the Marne, when the German army was stopped by the French. Unexpectedly, the Ukraine war has not gone as well for the United States as it expected. So they failed to knock out their weaker rival. Is this going to mean the end of the US empire? The fact they failed at the beginning? Well, the First World War went on for 4 years after the failure at the Marne. So it's not a brief crisis. We're overthrowing 5 centuries of Western domination, and this is going to come at the cost of great trauma for the world. Old alliances will break out, finances will shatter, states will descend into stasis and revolution. That's what happened last time. We know the US is openly planning war against Russia, but it's increasingly being subverted by openly planning war against China. They're put in sanctions, but these are being subverted. We know that DeepSeek has just overtaken OpenAI, despite the US putting sanctions on NVIDIA chips. It's also been shown that deindustrialization means the US and EU lack the capacity to combat the supply of military equipment that Russia and North Korea are able to achieve. And that's even before China has stepped in as a potential supplier of military equipment. China is not shipping weapons to Russia, but it could. So the US is trying to broaden its possible basis of support. Most important potential industrial powers that it can use are South Korea, Japan, and now let's look at its plan to transfer nuclear subs to Australia and see why that is important. What is the significance of the AUKUS treaty? Well, what is the AUKUS Pact? It's a defence pact between Australia, UK, and the US, which was announced in 2021. Downing Street said the AUKUS partnership will work to protect our people and support a peaceful and rules-based international order. Well, we know that rules-based means the US makes the rules. And the first initiative is establishing nuclear-powered submarines for Australia. They're going to build 8 nuclear submarines for Australia, and that's a lot. The British Astute program is only for 6. So they're building a large nuclear submarine fleet for Australia. They're likely to be a specially designed UK design of submarine called the SSN AUKUS. Now, why is this significant? Because the British and US nuclear reactors use highly enriched uranium. This enables them to run for 30 years without refueling. But if you supply highly enriched uranium to Australia, you're effectively giving Australia the means to construct nuclear weapons. And this has been pointed out by China as a potential breach of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. At the moment, Australia has no nuclear industry. It's a live discussion in Australia whether they'll develop a nuclear power industry. They have no nuclear power stations, no enrichment plants. So at the moment, they would be dependent on US or UK supplied fuel. But it's likely they would then build their own enrichment plants, their own reactors, and become a nuclear power on their own accord. And this is the most important thing. Construction is going to take place at Adelaide, at the Osborne Naval Shipyard. Why is that significant? It's because the Barrow-in-Furness plant and the Norfolk yards in the US are fully engaged in meeting the production of British and American submarines. They don't have the spare capacity to supply Australia with submarines. So this is an attempt to expand the military industrial base from US and Britain to Australia, and on a large scale. That's a large submarine program by world standards. And why do they want these? So it's 70 years after Britain became a nuclear power, testing bombs in Australia. They're giving this nuclear technology to Australia. Why? Boris Johnson says that it's to preserve security and stability in the Indo-Pacific when he announced it? Well, it's clear that this means it's an alliance against China. Now, are the submarines there to stop China invading Australia? No, there's no prospect of a Chinese invasion. More probably, they are part of joining a US-led preparation for a naval blockade of China. The allocation of duties is that the Australian Navy is to block the Straits of Malacca and the Straits here to cut off Chinese trade from the Indian Ocean and thereby from the rest of Africa and Europe. These are very narrow points at which a few submarines can effectively block the straits. But this assumes an actual war. We're getting increasing instances where NATO powers are detaining other ships, including Chinese ships, under allegations that they have been damaging cables, etc. But to actually start sinking ships with submarines, that's an actual war. And what would be the risks of such a war? Well, the key point is these submarines won't be available till the 2030s. And at the rate things are going, the conflict may well arise much sooner than that. Australian Home Affairs Department Secretary openly talking about the drums of war beating and come more loudly and ever closer. What the Chinese are saying is that there'll be a long sequence of escalations in the cross-straits game between China, the China mainland and the US. But the key step is going to be when they start flying fighter jets over Taiwan. They're openly saying this is what they're going to do. We're fully prepared that there'll be a showdown in the Taiwan Straits. We will send our first PLA fighter jet over the island at the most appropriate time. And that will be a milestone in the path of Chinese unification. So this is an official Chinese paper openly saying that's what they intend to do. So suppose that happens. If they flew them over Taiwan, and since the UN recognizes Taiwan as part of China, from the point of view of the UN, they're flying over Chinese airspace. The Chinese think that both the Taiwanese and the US will back down at that point. If they do, that means a peaceful resolution to the conflict over domination, and the US will start withdrawing further and further at that point. The reason why is that it's probable that the US would actually lose if it went to war with China now. I'm going to look at that. Firstly, we've seen in Ukraine that mutually assured destruction actually is preventing the use of nuclear weapons. And the same would apply in China. So we're going to look at the first year of such a war, what strategic resources they have, and how the war would end up. At the start, you have to realize that the Chinese have established an area of inhibition within which US carrier fleets can't readily operate because they're likely to be hit by anti-ship missiles. And the range of these missiles is considerably greater than the range of carrier-based aircraft. So that the kind of bombing of Vietnam that the US did from carriers is not going to work against China. The PLA can effectively establish air dominance over Taiwan. It can establish a blockade and transport sufficient forces ashore to eventually subdue Taiwanese resistance. US support will be limited to airlifts, in the period prior to Taiwanese air defenses being completely disabled. That's very, very limited, the support they can send in. There is a great overestimation of their own power by US politicians and the US general public. What the Ukraine war has shown is that it takes a great deal of modern weapons to put out of action even a third-rate industrial power like Ukraine. China is huge, its cities are huge, and it would take an enormous air force to seriously damage Chinese industrial capacity. It's much, much larger than Japan, which the US was able to attack. And the US no longer has those planes. It's a paper tiger in this sense. Their bomber force is largely made up of 60-year-old B-52 bombers. And these couldn't fly over China without being shot down. Those are the only planes with the range to reach. They only had 58 B-52s left. Originally, they had over 700. They have 20 B2s and 62 B1s, all of which are now quite old. But so in total, they have 140 bombers. Now that is actually less than the bomber force that Britain had in the 1960s. This is the degree of decline of the US Air Force. It's now at the level that the RAF was 60 years ago. The only way they could attack China is with cruise missiles. The current stockpile of US cruise missiles is about 4,500. By comparison, the Russians have fired 11,000 against Ukraine. And they have not brought Ukraine to defeat. The idea that this small stock of missiles launched from a small bomber force is going to defeat China is just ludicrous. Of course, these things are accurate, but there are so many targets in China, and we know that modern air defenses can bring down a lot of cruise missiles. That's why they are hoping to rely on an economic blockade to block Chinese trade. And were they to do that, though, it means a collapse of the economies of Europe and Africa and West Asia, all of whom are vitally dependent on Chinese imports. Something that was revealed during the COVID crisis, the most basic drugs, whether it's penicillin or what have you, is highly dependent on imports from China. If Chinese imports are cut down, all sorts of production immediately stops in Europe. Effectively, all chip supplies from Taiwan are going to disappear. All manufactured phones from China are going to disappear. The components necessary for cars are going to disappear. Let's look at shipbuilding. If you have a long naval war, sorry?
We have to move on in 2 minutes. Would it be okay to finish by then?
Okay, it won't take long. In a long naval war, shipbuilding capacity counts. The US defeated Japan because it could build far more ships. But if you look at current world shipbuilding, China built 14 million tons in 2020, Korea 12, Japan 8, Europe 3, and the rest of the world, including the US, 2.5. So the US could only operate if the Koreans and Japanese would build them ships. they could not replace their navy. Their navy wouldn't replace the losses, and they would have to give up. After 3 or more years of war, the US naval dominance would be gone, their economies would be in tatters, their political prestige would have sunk, and the future stability and unity of both the UK and the US would become doubtful. So basically, here, and if you're in Australia, you have to oppose the war preparations led by the US. It's a totally reactionary objective because it attempts to return to an economic order that's irretrievably lost now. And it's led by a parasitic financial oligarchy whose policies have for 50 years now, since the 70s, been holding down any advance in the conditions of labour. And it's in the interests of everyone, apart from a small minority, to defeat that oligarchy.
Thank you so much for the presentation. So we're going to have a couple minutes of Q&A for any questions that comrades might have for Paul and Eben. So yeah, please raise your hand if you've got any questions. I actually have a question for you, Paul. I was wondering, with the new Trump administration, what's your analysis on that when it comes to sort of the imperialist plans of the United States?
It looks as if the Trump administration may actually break up the ultra-imperialism by creating conflicts between the capitalist countries. I mean, if he really does proceed to attempt to seize Greenland and Canada, that is likely to really irretrievably break relations between the EU on the one hand over Greenland and the US, and if he annexes a Commonwealth country, that is almost politically impossible for a British government to go along with that. Were those things to occur, you're going to see the breakup of NATO and the US dominance of European foreign policy.